So the book I've chosen is called Sparks of Genius, 13 Thinking Tools of the World's Most Creative People. It is by a couple. I believe their names were Robert and Michelle Root-Bernstein, and they're both doctors. They're just married. Decided to write a book together. I'd like to think they're smart people. I saw some not TED Talks, but some interviews by them, and this is something they've put a lot of thought into, clearly. But the way this book is structured, it's a nonfiction book, obviously. It uses stories and examples of previous smart people to justify their 13 thinking tools. And there's essentially a few introductory chapters and then one chapter per thinking tool. And obviously I won't go through every thinking tool, but I'll just list them all and I'll also put them on the screen. The thinking tools are observing, imaging, abstracting, recognizing patterns, forming patterns, analogizing. I still can't say that word. It's basically making analogies, but body thinking, empathizing, dimensional thinking, modeling, playing, transforming, and synthesizing. Also, synthesizing education is the final tool. And while I won't go through all of the tools, I will discuss common themes among the tools and a sort of generic trend that the tools follow. And I will also, that will be the first section of this video, the thematic summary, and then the following sections will be separate video portions. So, thematic summary, here we are. As mentioned, there are 13 thinking tools. I won't go through all of them, but the first theme I would like to go into is how the thinking tools are structured. Basically, at least in my opinion, and what seems to be my professional diagnosis here, is that the thinking tools start off more generic or low-level thinking, and towards the end of it, they would be what I have learned in previous English classes and things like that to be high-level thinking, and the later tools build upon the earlier tools as well. Some examples of this, or some ways that you can see this are, first of all, the earlier tools are things like observing and imagining. Observing is pretty basic. It's just observing things that happen in the real world. They gave some sensual examples of this, but I'm pretty sure you get what observing is. And then imagining is, again, the ability to imagine things, remember things, things like that. Those are all pretty low-level stuff. And then you move on a little bit later and you get into recognizing patterns and forming patterns, which is taking these observations and these memories that you have and breaking them down into different patterns, which is analyzing that data. That's analysis, in my opinion. Same with I still can't say the word. Analogizing, making analogies of things. You are breaking that information down and making sense of it based off of stuff you already know. And then later on, you have synthesizing. Obviously, there's some other tools between there, but the later on tools is what I'm really focusing on here. And synthesizing, transforming and synthesizing is you take that information that you take the array of information that you've collected and your processing that you've done on that information, and you make some new ideas based off of that. And synthesis is often something that is considered high-level thinking. Is what you do when you have a quote, for example. What they've taught us all our lives is you take the quote, you analyze it, and then you add some of your own thoughts. That's synthesis. And these thoughts are often based off of years of your experiences, but also creative ideas that you've implemented into bringing these thoughts forward. And finally, after synthesizing, there's one more step that builds upon synthesizing, which is, in my opinion, the true understanding of an idea is when you can teach it. So there's the synthesizing education, where you can take that idea, simplify it down, and teach it to someone else. And that's really in my opinion, the final step that's can't get much more complex and higher level thinking than that. Moving on, the next theme, which I wanted to touch upon in the thematic summary, was the book's usage of math and mathematical concepts in conjunction with art to sort of show how they're both one and the same, and they both at their core sort of blend together. A good quote, paraphrasing here, was how good artists are also mathematicians and good mathematicians are also artists, and that's something I hold to be true in my real life as well. I think you need to have a little bit of both if you want to be successful in either. And the book went into a couple of examples here throughout. One of the examples was in the imagining section, and you'd think imagining doesn't exactly have a ton of math involved, but it was showed how it can be useful in math with when a physics problem with a man in a boat was solved using just a mathematical way, and then solved much easier using your imagination, and you were able to sort of imagine the physics rather than just do the math for the physics, and solve it a lot easier and understand the concepts a lot better using your mind. They use the term geometric for this, and geometry is touched upon again later on in various forms throughout the book as well. That's another mathematical concept, of course. The best showing of this, in my opinion, was in the recognizing patterns chapter, and in this chapter, it really brought together how how patterns can be used in both art and math. It showed a bunch of patterns in art and in music, and it showed how the recognizing those patterns can become useful to inspire new music, and to also understand existing music, and see what existing music drew inspiration from other music. And then also in math, it showed how recognizing those patterns can take complex mathematical calculations and really shrink them down into easier steps. And basically, it just showed how art and math are very similar, and the same mindset can be used to approach both of them. And if you have a way of solving problems in art, you can often do the same for math, and vice versa. Here we are for the final, or at least in my opinion, the final theme that I want to include in the thematic summary. Obviously, it's not the last theme in the book that I found, but I think this, combined with the last two themes that I've talked about, will give a good introduction to the book and a good idea on what the author is getting at. So this theme is the idea of making things simpler, and it's something that's found throughout the book in quite a few places. In my opinion, first found in the chapter abstracting. I'm going to diverge a little bit. The idea of abstraction was sort of mentioned like this in the book, but in computer science, which is my major, the idea of abstraction is taking a complex process and simplifying it to just be able to be used without knowing how it works underneath, or without thinking about how it works underneath all the time. And that's a similar idea that was brought forward in the abstracting section. That was explained for drawing, in using the art of drawing as how to abstract shapes in there and make drawing easier. That was one of the examples they gave there. And in making those things simpler, often you can find new meaning, and that's what else is talked about inside this section. Thinking about something, thinking about it for a while, lets you sort of process it in your head more, and you can come up with new ideas, and trying to simplify it often helps you stronger understand the ideas that are within the topic. The idea of simplification was also shown very nicely in this in the later on section of synthesis and synthesizing education, where you really have to take those ideas and process them and think them down in order to be able to make something of those ideas. And usually that thing should be more condensed, and teach that to somebody else. A few good quotes that show this really well from the book where, first of all, there's a Winston Churchill quote where he said he could talk for a day with 5 minutes of notice, but if you have to tell him to say something within 5 minutes, he needs a day to prepare and condense that down. And that, I think, shows how important condensing your ideas down is, and how difficult that is, and how much thought that requires. Another good quote here was by Mitchell Wilson, in which he said, "I'll tell you what you need to be a great scientist. You don't need to be able to understand very complicated things. It's just the opposite. You have to be able to see what something looks like and find the underlying simplicity, and that's what you really need." And that's something it really touches upon in this chapter more. Simplicity is important in understanding something, because often by making things simple, you learn new ideas that you then could you gain a new understanding of it in yourself. And anybody who's done any sort of teaching will tell you that the best way to truly understand something is to teach it to someone else. They showed this through art and drawings as well, where there were drawings done with in an abstracted way from the original drawings, and they were in their own ways different art, and basically a new purpose was drawn out of the art just by abstracting it, still trying to maintain the same initial intent, but in a different form and in a different drawing. The final quote here, which I think transitions us well into the how this relates to our class section, is a Beethoven quote in which he explained his process of thinking and how he carries his thoughts in his head for a long time before writing them down, almost processing them. And in my opinion, that shows just how much, even if he doesn't condense them very much, how much he has to think about them. And I'm sure the complex ideas are simplified and therefore furthered in his head as well. And that transitions well into how this relates to our stuff, because all of these processes are something that require a lot of mindfulness and a lot of thinking, and that's something that we've talked about a lot in this class. So, as mentioned, the way this relates to the class, in my opinion, the way it most relates to the class is the mindfulness aspect of it, and how all of these are really thought-intensive processes, and you really do have to think and be able to use your mind well. And if you have a chaotic mind, if you don't have good control of your mind, then that's something that won't be accomplished very easily. And fortunately, what we've been learning in this class ties into that very well, because the whole meditative practices we've been doing, and practices of mindfulness and trying to do some meditation, helps us to gain more control over our own minds and strengthen our minds, and give us more clarity to perform some of these more complex thoughts. Another tie-in I'd like to add for that specifically is how, with the Beethoven example, when I'm doing my meditation, I can't just get to the clear mind state right away. I have to clear out all of the things I've been thinking about all day, and in doing that, I unintentionally do some processing on that, and I have to do some sort of deep thinking about that in order to at least dismiss it from my mind. I don't know if that's how it works for everyone, but I've heard that's how it works for some people, and I know that's how it works for me. So some of that processing happens unintentionally there, and that's something that we're getting better at because we're doing more meditative practices. I'd like to think it's not like we're not thinking about those things. We're just clearing our mind and bringing the main conscious focus somewhere else. Some of that still probably happens in the subconscious, and some of that processing still happens. It's sort of like, I don't know if you've noticed, when you'd go away, you'd learn a concept in math class, for example, in school, and then you'd go away over summer break and you'd come back, and the thing you were struggling on earlier for some reason comes a lot easier to you now, even though you've not really done much practice on it or any practice on it. It's been I like to think of it as sort of cooking in your mind a little bit. So there were quite a few tie-ins to the class I found in this book, and I can't obviously go through all of them, but for clarity's sake. But I'd like to
really bring the attention to one of the earliest things we've talked about in class, education. We touched upon education and teaching and the idea of knowing, and this book has focused on education definitely in quite a few ways. It brings forward the ideas of how what it thinks the more proper education is, and that's a more holistic education approach. Use your whole body and your senses and your mind. And that's something I tend to agree with. And I'd like to think that while we didn't, nothing we spoke about specifically in this class said that exactly. Um, a lot of the stuff we've talked about in this class, if you combine it, those ideas are found in this book as its approach to education. And I think that lines up with what we've been talking about in class for quite a lot of it.
So, an introduction to this book for the other students in this class, other than what I've mentioned already, this book is for anyone who likes self-help books, who likes nonfiction books, who likes books about how to improve their lifestyle and how to improve their thought processes. This book is interesting for anyone interested in psychology because while it doesn't really directly relate to that, it has some of those concepts definitely. This book is a 404 page, 14 plus chapter book that I found really interesting, and I really resonated with a lot of the things that they talked about in the book. And even you, if you read the book, I'm sure you'll also see there's a lot of the stuff that you're already doing. I mean, I'm sure you guys are all smart. You guys are all honors students, and there's a lot of practices in this book that I didn't realize I was doing subconsciously already, and I didn't realize why they were important, but I guess I was already doing them, and I'm sure you'll find that as well. So, if anything, that's another good reason to read this book. But yeah, thank you for listening to my book review. I do give this book a positive score, and that is all.